Do you remember the first time you saw the movies Lord of the Rings, or maybe you read the books and you thought to yourself, wow, this Sauron character, I apologize for mispronouncing it, Sauron, is really evil. This character is supernatural being that wants to rule all of creation with this superpowered ring. And there are other rings, but this one ring rules them all. Well, is someone like that or something like that necessary for peace? Consider all the squabbles that society has, all the unrest, civil discourse, even civil wars that we have, and consider that the price of those disruptions, civil wars, is so high, so incredible, that maybe something as radical as having one ruler, one ring to rule them all, might be needed. Well, in a way, this is Thomas Hobbes. He's going to argue that in the name of peace, if we truly want peace, we are going to have to sacrifice some of our rights. We're going to have to sacrifice some of our desires, perhaps, so that we might have the one ruler that will bring peace. A Sauron, maybe? Hopefully minus the genocide and murderous intent. Who was Thomas Hobbes? Thomas Hobbes, 1588 to 1679, so a little bit before I was born, maybe before you were born, is a famous English philosopher. He's best known for his work Leviathan, a controversial text that we'll talk about. He was college educated. He worked as a tutor to a wealthy family. To give you some sense of the context, when he was a boy, some of Shakespeare's most famous plays were enacted. Descartes actually got to meet Galileo. You may be familiar with that person, or the idea that Galileo, the scientific method, are quite popular. Or René Descartes, he met René Descartes as well. Hobbes is said to be something of a bit of a charmer, witty, funny character. People took him seriously, of course, but he also had that funny side. At 6 feet tall, which is quite tall for that era, he was known as someone who would stand out in a crowd, of course. He's one of the first of the great social theorists, social contract theorists. There are others, such as John Rawls, who will argue that for you and I to have a better world, to have a better place to live and to grow and to flourish, and whatever that might mean, we need to, as a society, come together. There are different forms of this, and have a contract with one another. As we've already discussed in my previous videos on Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, Hobbes also lived during a time of war, of conflict, civil war actually in England, but also internationally. So like Plato, Socrates, and Aristotle, he spent a lot of his time thinking about human conflict and how it might be avoided or overcome or somehow resolved. Consider that for a moment. We started our conversation over 2,400 years ago. Now fast forward the 1600s, and he's still wrestling with the problem of civil war. Well, even today, we still have the issue. So what did Hobbes recognize? That humans had failed. Humanity has failed to achieve peace. Political thought had failed. Theorists had failed. The outcome speaks for itself. There's still civil war. There's still death, dying, and unnecessary death and dying. As one of the most controversial thoughts, Hobbes, he follows closely on the thinking of Machiavelli. Machiavelli opens the way for much of Hobbes's discussion. Hobbes is in many ways more radical, as we'll see. So 3 big questions to consider. What do we need to make society run well? Really, let's just be honest with ourselves. What do we need? And how extreme do we need to be to achieve that? What we need for Hobbes is not like we saw with Plato, Aristotle, the idea that we somehow have to find harmony through reason or harmony through elevating our minds, contemplation, even ethics. He's going to rethink ethics in many ways. So what we need for society to run well will look a little bit different, a lot different. What kind of leader must we have to make this all work, assuming we even need a leader? And here is perhaps one of the most obvious of his famous contributions. He's going to argue that the leader we need is not the leader you would expect, maybe not even the leader you would hope for, but it's a leader that is necessary, a very radical form. All of this conversation is asking, what is the proper shape of society? What should we expect from the world around us? What are our ambitions? Because if we aim too high, as he will argue, not just high, but too theoretical, too abstract, if we aim that high, as we saw with Aristotle or Plato, we're going to completely miss the mark. Ergo, we're going to have centuries of unrest and discord. And if we aim too low, well, maybe we won't achieve the mark either. But Hobbes believes he's aiming at a very practical, very achievable, very rational, and he's going to say scientific goal. Well, let's see if you agree. A few of the big themes for Hobbes includes materialism, utilitarianism, rationalism, egoism, and contractarianism. Let's just briefly describe each of these before we go into depth. Materialism flies in the face, again, of Plato, Socrates, Aristotle. Hobbes is going to really stress an external world. The world that we see is the world that we need to be focused on. Aristotle tended to get close to that because he was trying to be very scientific and very observant of the natural world. But Hobbes is very much concerned that even Aristotle believes there's a supernatural that will make sense of this world, or that there are forms inside of us that will help us make sense of us. And that's not clear for Hobbes at all that actually works. Essentialism, remember we all have essences and we need to realize those essences with Aristotle, that's not where he's going to go. The immortality of the soul, that's not where he's going to go. Higher reason connected with forms, heavenly forms, that's not where he's going to go. He's not happy. He's very much this materialist approach. His faith, interestingly enough, he seems to have had faith. He seems to have believed in a supernatural reality, but there's considerable debate with Hobbes regarding whether he really was a Christian, whether he really did believe in a supernatural. What we can say is that his political philosophy is very much a materialist account of how to make sense of human dynamic. His utilitarianism couldn't be more obvious. The goal is to maximize the most amount of good and minimize the most amount of pain. It's very simple calculus in that regard. We want the most amount of possible, feasible, tangible, practical happiness that a society can have, and we want to minimize pain. But just how much pleasure we think we're going to get for Hobbes is a matter of debate. And maybe that's one of the reasons we constantly have things like civil war and unrest, that we think we deserve more happiness or more good than we actually do, than what's actually achievable. So we're always overestimating the amount of good, whereas if we're truly utilitarian, we'll realize that the balancing mechanism to achieve peace and civil harmony maybe doesn't quite go as high as we would like, and that settling actually yields greater happiness overall. But we'll get back to that. He also falls into the rationalist category, or way of thinking, that human reason or human knowledge is far superior to dogma and tradition. Doing what others have done previously, thinking the way others have previously, has not led to success in terms of peace, civil harmony. So we need to rethink rationally how we ought to run the world around us. Hobbes is also famous for his egoism. Maybe he had a lofty ego, but his belief is that you and I are driven by our self-interest. So he begins his philosophy by saying, this is the human, and the human is driven by self-interest, what they can get from whatever the situation they're in. So when we understand the human, rather than trying to imagine them as being magnanimous, as we saw with Aristotle, as someone who tries to find a harmony with nature, as we saw with Aristotle, Hobbes is saying, let's just be honest. People are egotistical, and that is really dangerous unless we appreciate it and understand it and begin to make the world better, with that caveat, which is that people are self-driven. As one of the most famous contract theorists, his contract theory basically says this, that in order for you and I to gain some kind of advantage, whether that be peace or security or food, shelter, and whatnot, all these different things, we need to escape the natural condition, which is a condition of lawlessness, and we do that through a social contract. All of us to gain need to come together and have a contract. Hobbes is living in an era that is awash with this idea of the scientific revolution, this amazing thing called the scientific revolution. Shortly before Hobbes, we had people like Copernicus, Galileo, Kepler, that pushed for scientific methodologies. It's a paradigm shift for many people in which observation and deductive reasoning are going to pave the way forward, not spirituality necessarily, not religion necessarily, certainly not politics of old. We need to be scientific in going forward. Now, you'll notice that Aristotle tried to do this. He was the father of so many sciences, but we can think of the time with Hobbes as a reawakening, a re-enlightening in a way, regarding the need to rethink humans through the scientific lens. So, purely physical, what is our nature? What is the nature of humanity? What is the nature of human society? And how do we make this work? Piggybacking then on this new obsession with scientific methodology, he wants to create something new. He believes he's creating a new political science, again, following on the scientific revolution that overthrew what came before. So all previous politics or political science that had failed, hopefully his was going to be a success, bringing a new kind of peace, a new kind of order. There's a very practical outcome now. He's not just in this to become famous for writing a radical textbook. He genuinely wants an outcome, a better world. So my question to you, how far would you be willing to go for order and peace? I know these are open-ended terms, but how far would you be willing to go? The world still knows that we don't have it. People are hurting. There's pain. There's suffering. And it's needless. The world is watching in horror as the Taliban takes over Afghanistan, and everyone's kind of waiting with bated breath to hope that there won't be human rights violations, and that women will be allowed to, be women without being under the thumb of an autocratic regime. So what would we be willing to do for world peace, global peace? And does Hobbes have something to contribute to that? His materialistic account of us, of social existence, boils down to something like this. We're bodies in motion. So he's not worried about souls. He's not worried about our spirits, as we saw with previous thinkers. He sees us as these basically machines living life. Now, if we can make sense of ourselves as these machines, what is human behavior? Why do humans want what they want, do what they want? Then there are a few things that can happen. So stage one, figure out the human machine. What is it that we do and why? Stage two, find some consensus. Because if we figure out the machine, the animal, the human, then we can figure out what the animal, human, machine wants. In this case, he's going to say peace and stability. So we're going to get agreement on that because it's just what we are as these things in motion. And as a result of that, we move on to the biggest prize of them all, peace. Peace. So we find agreement based on a description, an accurate description of what we are. And what is that agreement going to be on? Peace and stability. Amazing. It's something that we haven't achieved before. Why? Because of the lofty, theoretical, impractical ambitions of previous theorists, maybe. An unwillingness to go as far as Hobbes is going to say we need to go to achieve this. So how serious are you about peace? You may not want to follow Hobbes where he's going to go all the way. So again, sorry Aristotle, for Hobbes, we do not naturally aim towards the good. There's not something in us that's leading us on to better, better, better. That's not how he sees it. For Hobbes, basically, you and I want to avoid death. We are driven by fear, sort of these rudimentary emotions. The language of human flourishing and purpose that we saw in Aristotle, no way for Hobbes. That is just too grandiose, and that's just another reason why we haven't achieved peace. We're not making these rational decisions on a day-to-day basis. We're just doing our best to avoid death, in our fear of death. Assuming for the moment that Hobbes has a better sense of the human condition than the previous philosophers, we arrive at the same question we had with them. What will work and what will get the job done? His raw pragmatism is that we need to do something, like we need to physically do something. Nature will not push us towards the good, contra Aristotle, so it's not going to happen by accident. And we need to reorder the social world fundamentally. It may mean sacrificing whatever your government is. Democracy certainly is at stake here. What we need is an indirect or a representational government. What in the world does that mean? Well, again, whatever it is, that's what we need to make things work, he believes. We need a leader in complete control. The sovereign, or the Sauron. The sovereign is a reconstruction of our will. Now remember, he's trying to figure out what we are as people. So let's assume for the moment that he's right, something about fear, something about just being purely physical bodies, none of this higher elevated faculty stuff. What is the sovereign? The sovereign is an embodiment of our desire for peace. All of us universally, if that's what we are as machines, as things in motion, that we're desiring peace, then he's onto something here. The sovereign, this new leader, is an abstraction, representation of our wills, our universal wills. Notice the power of this is not that you and I have gone to a ballot box and we've selected somebody that we like as a candidate, and then that candidate's made a bunch of promises and now they're in office and they're going to live those promises out. No, Hobbes is saying that this person has legitimate power and authority in society because they're seeking the basics, the very, very basics of what all of us want. You may say you want tax reform, you may say you want better health care, but none of that really matters. What matters is peace. Having a sovereign in power transforms the instability of nature, transforms the instability of the world around us in a way that's favorable to us, that brings us hopefully something like stability or peace, a lack of conflict. But it's unnatural in a way, it's abnormal in a way, because it doesn't exist unless we do it, unless we achieve it ourselves. The wordier term for this idea of having a sovereign is political absolutism. Political absolutism. One person with total and complete control over everyone. Sauron. The power of the sovereign. So here's a picture that epitomizes or demonstrates the power of the sovereign. And if you look closely, it's so you see he's got a crown. In one hand he has a sword. In the other hand he has a scepter. This is from Hobbes's book. If you look very, very closely, you'll see that this much larger than life character that's bigger than anyone else in society is actually made up of people. So there are tiny, tiny people, hundreds of people inside the body of this sovereign. What are we learning here? Well, we're learning that, again, there's something about our universal will, if he's right about us wanting peace, is embodied, literally in this case, figuratively of course, embodied in this sovereign who has complete control, the power to inspire fear, the power to change laws, to be the source of laws. And if you look at the bottom, on the left-hand side, you see emblems of state power, the cannon, a military, a castle. On the right-hand side, you see emblems of religion or the church. So over all things, over the military, the government, over state authority of any kind, over all forms of religion, human rights groups, you name it, school curriculum, which books can be allowed, and so on, is the sovereign. Total and complete authority. That's how radical Hobbes believes we need to be to make the world better, to reshape, to reorder the world. Creation, our new creation, is this world of a sovereign, of having a sovereign that inspires fear, but at the same time, that embodied fear is what partially brings about peace. Consider for a moment, how important could a leader be? How strong and effective can a leader be without real fear? So not just partial fear, absolute fear. I don't know if you're watching right now in the U.S., a deadlock really between Republicans and Democrats in terms of any kind of policy decision, any kind of activity. The government recently avoided a shutdown because they can't agree on whether or not to raise the debt ceiling, how much the country can owe, so they wouldn't be able to pay federal employees and whatnot. In other words, Biden, who's the current president, wanted to raise the debt limit. Republicans said no, but because he doesn't inspire fear, end of the story. Things don't get done, unrest continues, and a government is just utterly ineffectual. Without fear over others, we can't get the job done, or so believes Hobbes, as embodied by the sovereign. Okay, so there's the promise of peace, of a good world, a good society, but it comes at the cost. The cost of us being afraid of the sovereign? Yeah. We're already afraid of life, though. We're already afraid of death. So it's kind of a new fear in a way, but it's also the promise of we gain something that we could not gain in any other way. We could not gain genuine peace without some kind of sacrifice to this sovereign. So at the end of the day, we have to give up some of our rights to this absolute ruler. The benefit is, again, peace, whatever that may mean, and it's supposed to be worth our while. But this idea that we don't have to have a social contract where we all come together and give power to the sovereign, if you think you can live a life of peace without doing that, you're fooling yourself. And what's the proof? Thousands of years of human history in which there was no Sauron, there was no one sovereign ruler to rule them all, absolutely. There was always a warring party or civil conflict, or people didn't take the leaders seriously, and so governments were overturned time and time again. In this case, this entity is so terrifying that is alone what accounts for the possibility of peace. All right, so Hobbes is trying to be scientific. He thinks he understands us and what we really need. He understands that there's going to be a trade-off. We can't have our cake and eat it too. And if we're serious about human stability, of having a good world to live in, we're going to have to sacrifice some of our rights, maybe some of our options, and our wills will have to be embodied in one person over us all, one ring to rule them all. What kind of person or entity would this be? What kind of authority? How does that work? In practical terms, he's going to call this, again, the sovereign, but in practical terms, what would that actually look like? In his famous book, Leviathan, he tries to answer this question. He was in his 60s when he wrote the text, and he's going to argue that authority in this case is derived, again, not surprising, he likes to talk about fear, from fear. The Leviathan is a new way of thinking about society in which anarchy is subdued, in which chaos is subdued, in which, again, civil unrest, civil conflict is overcome through a sovereign that focuses our fear in a way that allows us to achieve a greater measure of happiness, something that is sustainable, so it's not just temporary, it's not just transient, and that's meaningful, and of course is practical. Now remember, Hobbes has lowered the bar quite a bit to what counts as successful human life. So let's see if you agree with what he has to say. This sovereign, this godlike sovereign, a mortal god, but a sort of a demigod nonetheless, is not a part of the contract that you and I are a part of. You and I join together, and this person is unique. This person has absolute power. Now, they have the absolute power. They're legitimated as having absolute power because they provide peace. Not because they provide a whole repertoire, a buffet of happiness, but because they provide peace, the basic, right, the minimum. If the mortal god, the sovereign, can't provide that, then of course they'd be highly questionable as someone who should hold that office. And this thinking for Hobbes is very much like a CEO in an office. But in this case, the CEO doesn't really own society, so the CEO is running society. But unlike a CEO in corporations today, the board members can't get together and kick him out. Whatever laws the sovereign comes up with are laws. The power has to be unlimited. This is the absolutism that we were talking about a moment ago. The power of the sovereign has to be absolute, because if there's even a sliver of doubt where somebody could come in and who's not afraid and try to dislodge them from office, then that threatens the stability and the peace of society as a whole. And how do we know that? Well, again, because we've seen this time and time again. We need absolute power in the sovereign if we are to achieve some measure of sustainable harmony. In this way, then, we could say the sovereign can never be wrong, because the sovereign is the one who tells us what's right. The sovereign is one who determines school curriculum. The order of society is at the very whim of the sovereign. And as long as the sovereign is maintaining peace in some way, no matter how radical the sovereign may be, that's okay. So here's a question. What if the sovereign is abusive? What if the sovereign occasionally goes out into town and kicks somebody for fun, or kills somebody for fun? Well, overall, I mean, obviously that's not ideal, but overall, that's still better, according to Hobbes, than the state of nature. That's still better overall than all of the other alternatives, specifically war and conflict. Even having a kind of a loony, crazy sovereign, at least that provides you something that we can't get from nature, or we don't get from nature, and that has never been achieved previously. Consider this paragraph. This is a depiction of Hobbes' most famous metaphor. This is from Hobbes now, chapter 13. In such condition, there is no place for industry, because the fruit thereof is uncertain, and consequently no culture of the earth, no navigation, nor use of the commodities that may be imported by sea, no commodious building, no instruments of living and moving, such things as require much force, no knowledge of the face of the earth, no account of time, no arts, no letters, no society, and which is worst of all, continual fear, and the danger of violent death, and the life of man, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Huh? This is a hypothetical, and what he's saying is, pre-politics, pre-laws, pre-police, so get rid of laws and police wherever you are, gone. What are humans? Just humans in nature? And it's a state of nature, and it's terrible. It's a terrible place to be. We lack knowledge, we lack understanding, no arts, no letters, no society, no account of time, and so on and so on. A very, very bad place. Now, this is hypothetical because you and I only know society. We only know a world with some laws, and they may not be very good laws, and we only know a world with kind of maybe poor social ordering, but we already live in a world of social ordering. So that's why this is a hypothetical thought experiment. But he's doing this because, again, he's trying to make sense of what is the human being as just this machine. And this is the famous passage that you may have heard many times before. The life of man is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Okay, so even though the society we live in or you live in may not be the best, hopefully it's at least alleviating some of those things. But again, Hobbes is saying not enough, and only in a temporary fashion until the next crisis hits us. So we need to figure out how to overcome, to revision, to reorder, to restructure our lives so that we don't fall into the state of nature, and that we don't just stay where we are in mediocre, kind of messy societies, but that we end up with sustainable peace. And that's what the sovereign is charged with doing, and that's what his book, The Leviathan, is trying to explore. How to overcome this terrible state of life. What would we look like without powerful laws and rulers lording over us? Would we really be these kind of evil creatures? Would we really be these people constantly at war with one another? He believes that in the state of nature, you and I are all roughly equal. Some of us may be taller or smaller. Some of us may have bigger muscles than others. But we're all in equal fear of being killed. Even the smallest among us could poison the biggest among us. Right? So in that sense, we're kind of all equal in terms of our ability to hurt the other person. None of us have claws. None of us have big fangs or something like that. So we're all cunning. We're all equal in that sense. What that means then is that if we're all kind of equal in terms of how we can inflict hurt on the other person, then we're in competition for resources, then it's a constant war. It's a constant state of crisis. Capitalism thrives on that, a business competition, right? Where it tries to build a harmony where the most successful companies are the ones that have the best product at the best price. But that's not the kind of competition he's talking about. He's saying there are no rules. There are no rules in the state of nature. It's a dog-eat-dog world. And humans have no sense of following best business practices. They're willing to do whatever it takes to survive. Why? Because we're all being motivated by fear. We all want safety. We're motivated by fear. There are three main reasons that there is what he calls the endless conflict here, the war of all against all. The three basic reasons are competition over resources. We want to gain things. Okay, we do. We want to gain shelter, food, maybe just a plot of land. We want these things. And because there's no government to regulate who gets what land, we're going to kill anybody that comes in front of us, or maybe somebody trying to kill us to get our stuff. Two, fear of others, or fear of being different. We all want to be safe, but again, somebody who shows up that we've never known before. Remember, there aren't really societies in the state of nature. They're just people wandering around all the time. So you're different, you're scary, you threaten me, I'm going to go get my club. Like, just imagine the worst of the worst. But also there's a little bit more civil side of the bad side, is this desire for respect or glory. You want to get a reputation, maybe, among other people. That's a motivating force as well. So you want stuff. Well, that seems to be true of a lot of people today. They want stuff. Some people want too much stuff. We call them hoarders. We call them being greedy. And major mainstream corporations actually can hurt developing nations, third world nations, slave labor and whatnot, child labor specifically, because they're greedy for things. But on an individual, in a state of nature, pre-corporation, individuals, you and I would do bad things like that too. Fear of others, and a desire for glory or respect. All of these things make society unstable, unsustainable, in the sense that we're not going to have peace. We're going to have constant conflict. And we're going to have this conflict in societies because the state of nature, if it's, again, a theoretical thing, if it's true, is in us as we're trying to create society. And the forces currently at play, the laws and the politicians, the lawyers and the judges, these people don't recognize just how powerful the state of nature is, so they're not able to control that, and so our societies implode. Right? They kind of cave in on themselves because our systems aren't radical enough to handle the truly evil nature of what we are as a species. Now, when I say evil, it's not a very good term. A lot of people associate the word evil with spiritual evil, like Satan or something like that. In a Hobbesian sense, remember, he's trying to analyze nature, and nature is just nature. So just giving the word evil to nature kind of gives it a human interpretation that might not be fair. But I think for the most part, most of us would see that human beings in the state of nature are not delightful creatures. And when that translates into society, because our rules are not strong enough, because we do not have a sovereign, then again, the bad things continue on, which is why we have widespread corruption, even among our police. And of course, even the Panama Papers, now the Pandora Papers, were released recently, showing how world leaders around the world, very wealthy people, seem to have no sense of obligation to the poor. Instead, they find all these tax havens so they don't have to pay taxes in their own countries, which in many cases may be legal, but it's highly immoral, right? Again, it's that gain, me, gain. So Hobbes is right on some of these drivers for what we do as a people. Notice also the anti-romanticism. Aristotle looked at nature and really prized it for giving us instruction on how to become ethical, how to become better, how to find a mean between extremes, how to find human purpose. You want human purpose, you got to look to nature. Hobbes looks at nature and goes, that's terrifying, that's scary. And in a way, I have to agree. Nature is kind of scary. And most animals will die of starvation or disease or just painful deaths, right? You don't ever see squirrels moving to Florida to a retirement home. It doesn't happen. Nature's brutal, right? Okay, so let's de-romanticize nature, as we saw with Aristotle. That's not going to achieve what we want. It's not a helpful model for us. Let's realize that nature does not provide a guide. Nature does not provide this great guide for making us better. In fact, let's just kind of start inward with the machines, you and I as machines, that live in fear. Fear and survival are our primary motivators. Fear and survival. So in that sense, his discussion of this hypothetical, that doesn't exist anywhere, but this hypothetical state of nature, that version of nature does give us some instruction about what we are. Not necessarily what we need to do to make things better, but it tells us about what we are. And what are we? We're in a constant state of war. What are we? We are the creatures that need to rise above it. We need to move beyond our fear nature. Or that nature, fear, state of nature that holds us back. and through the sovereign have a different kind of fear that, again, will hopefully produce peace. But that's how we change from state of nature through the sovereign to a state of fear that's more sustainable in terms of peace, if that makes sense. We rise above the state of nature through our represented wills, indirect government in the sovereign. The state of nature tells us about the nature of fear. Paranoia reigns supreme in the state of nature. We're constantly afraid. And this is, for Hobbes, just a matter of fact. The state of nature shows us how futile our efforts have been to achieve security and happiness. They just don't work. Life has remained, for many people on this planet, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. And so, if that's true, if life has remained as bad as he seems to think it has been, then this in turn justifies this sovereign, the changing of nature, the changing of ourselves, the changing of society through this sovereign. As radical as the sovereign is, that becomes justified based on how radically bad and painful the alternative is. So this only makes sense when we realize just how bad this is. So let's step back one more time. What is he arguing? He's arguing that we need to rethink the human person, we need machine, we need to rethink what's possible and what's feasible. We need to realize that people are not naturally driven towards some mysterious good, like flourishing or purpose. People are motivated by fear. People are motivated by a constant struggle for power. We're bodies in motion, we're restless, and we're afraid of people that might hurt us, while simultaneously wanting what those people may have. It's endless conflict. So if we're honest with ourselves, endless conflict. And the only way to rise above that natural condition, worst case scenario, state of nature in society, people still in conflict, but a better situation is one with a sovereign or someone who inspires genuine awe. A kind of fear that isn't just a repellent fear. So there are different kinds of fear, but it's a kind of fear of absolute respect. The sovereign is our will, our desire for peace. That's what gives legitimacy to the sovereign. But at the same time, we can't vote the sovereign out. We can't question the sovereign. We can't challenge the sovereign. There's no way. You would never hear a media outlet criticize the sovereign. Why? Because then that media outlet would quickly disappear. The radicality, for lack of a better word, the radical need for an all-powerful mortal God being negates criticism. It negates being challenged. So what's required for peace, actual peace and stability? Things that you and I would not want to give up as a civil society today. Today we want free discourse, open conversation. We want public debate. We want our leaders to be held account when they make questionable moral decisions. Hobbes is saying, if we want these things, we're going to miss out. If we want these things, we can't have what's needed to really get the job done. In a purely pragmatic way, what works is a sovereign. What doesn't work is the half measures of democracy. Hence the reason Hobbes is held to be such a controversial figure. So what is morality? What is the best politics? What is the best activity for humans? To seek peace at all cost.